Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. Just as the United States announces a new policy towards Sudan, the United Nations is warning of more violence to come, saying rebel forces and government troops are building up again in Darfur. On Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton unveiled a new policy which she hopes will end human rights abuses and what the U.S. refers to as genocide in Darfur. Washington wants implementation of the 2005 peace plan, including elections next year. It also wants Sudan to stop providing sanctuaries for what it calls international terrorist groups. The U.S. says it will use a combination of incentives to encourage Sudan's government to end the violence, as well as increased pressure on it if the fighting and human rights abuses continue. Today we ask, will this carrot and stick approach work to build peace in Sudan? And can it take effect soon enough to prevent further death and destruction? A reminder, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and we also welcome your phone calls, of course, on the show. Joining us today to discuss the crisis in Sudan, from London, Tahir El-Faqi, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of the Justice and Equality Movement, the strongest rebel military force in Darfur. And here with me in Washington is John Norris, Executive Director of the Enough Project, one of the leading non-profit groups fighting to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity around the world. Welcome to both of you to the show. Dr. El-Faqi, let me start with you. As I mentioned there, this new policy of the United States is being widely interpreted as a carrot and stick approach towards Sudan. Essentially, the sanctions will stay in place, but the U.S. is also offering incentives. The only incentive we know about right now is that they're offering some kind of dialogue. We don't have too many details on the incentives, but what do you think of that approach?
First of all, I have to thank the United States authority for showing its commitment to the Sudanese problem in Darfur and to the Sudanese problem as a whole. And this is from the highest level, and the presentation of the strategy by Secretary of the State and Ambassador Rice, as well as Scott Gresham, shows that America has come with a clear policy that it wants to see that the Sudan will benefit from peace. There are issues within this strategy. There are positive things, but unfortunately there are some negatives or things that we wish that it should have been included. First of all, the approach by the United States to the Sudanese problem as in a holistic approach, this is very welcome, and as well as the acknowledgement of what happened in Darfur as genocide. This is also acknowledged, and we are very happy that America continues to consider what happened in Darfur as genocide.
Okay.
The other thing is, yeah.
Okay. Well,
so
let me ask
also focusing on a long-term solution to the Sudan, and as well as the Sudan should not be a safe haven for terrorists. We welcome those. But the negative thing is we wish that America should not have given incentive to a murderous Pol Pot replica-like regime or Khmer Rouge-like regime in Sudan by giving them incentives.
Okay, so I want to go now to our guest here in Washington, John Norris. John Norris, you've written that this policy review has given the Obama administration the opportunity to push the reset button. Have they pushed that button?
Well, it really depends how the policy is ultimately implemented. The idea of incentives and pressures, I think, is a fairly non-controversial one, but the document did not spell out exactly what those incentives or pressures are. Those are treated as classified, and it lays out a process for establishing benchmarks, but it doesn't share what those benchmarks are. So I think there's an awful lot of question marks surrounding this. The administration has been getting a lot of negative press for its handling of Sudan, for the length it took to complete the policy review, and the real question now is, will they breathe life into a policy on paper, and will the President, Vice President, Secretary of State really start to own the issue of Sudan at a very senior level?
Okay, let's go now to New York. From New York, Mahmoud Mamdani, the director of Columbia University's Institute of African Studies, joins us. Professor Mamdani is also the author of a new book, Saviors and Survivors, Darfur, Politics and the War on Terror. Welcome to the show, sir. We've been talking
Thank you for having me.
We've been talking about the new policy that has been adopted by the United States, what has been referred to as a carrot and stick approach. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a shift in policy, and I think the shift is first and foremost an acknowledgement that conditions on the ground have changed. It's an acknowledgement that the level of violence, the number of civilians killed, dramatically declined after 2005. This change has been confirmed by highest levels of the UN, Adada, who just went out, and the chief of the UNAMID forces. Both of them have said that the situation in Darfur is no longer an emergency, that it's a low-intensity conflict. USAID officials also confirm that there has been a movement of refugees out of the IDP camps into villages, that this is not simply the seasonal movement of those who go to cultivate their crops to harvest them, but this is a long-term movement, and that the major obstacle is banditry in the countryside. So I think that, first of all, it's an acknowledgement that the situation is better than it has been before. Secondly, it's also an acknowledgement that Darfur policy has been fragmented, and a separate policy for Sudan policy has been fragmented. There's been a separate policy for Darfur and a separate one for South, and that Sudan policies has tended to be driven by activist interests in the US who are better organized around Darfur, and that in fact, as the situation in Darfur improves, that in the South is worsening, and there is need for a single integrated policy. Finally, I think there is the understanding that the language of genocide is an obstacle and has been an obstacle to the development of a proper Darfur policy. Now, there is a battle, a struggle, a tension inside the administration. So the language remains, but there's a recognition that even though in the South, the length of the violence was for decades, whereas in Darfur it was for years, and many more died in the South than in Darfur, the language of genocide was not used in the South, even though the violence was racialized in the South and ethnic in Darfur. So in the South, it's been possible to reach negotiations and a solution, but in Darfur, if you brand a regime as genocidaire, it's very difficult to speak of negotiations with that same government. So that's a dilemma.
Do you take that point, Dr. El-Faki, that if the forces in the South are branded, or the Sudanese government is branded as committing genocide, then it's going to be very difficult to talk to them, it's going to be very difficult to resolve this crisis?
You see, I don't think there is anybody, even al-Bashir himself would not have spoken better than Professor Mamdani in expressing these views. These are odd ideas, which is only paying off for a murderous regime, and I am really shocked. I have read Saviors and Survivors, and now I am hearing also on the background Professor Mamdani saying those ideas which are by far different from the realities. There are 2.7 million people IDPs. There is over 300,000 people dead, and yet he comes to say and to approve what Adada said on the 27th of April, that the Darfur conflict is a low intensity conflict. The reality is not. There are people there are people still in the IDPs. People are dying, and if he thinks that the number of deaths is something that is to be based upon and say that this is genocidal or not, this is the wrong argument. What we think now is the Sudan government is building forces, and he knows that Sudan government is now building forces in the north of Darfur, in the south, and in the western Darfur, and trying to flush and to finish and to do a wide military confrontation with us. So how can Madani say this is a low-intensity conflict, and that situation is improving? This is only to fool the international community.
Okay, well, let me give
enough. They work very well on that situation.
All right, let me give Professor Mamdani a moment to respond to that. We have about 30 seconds before the break, Professor.
Okay, look, let's put this in context. First of all, there was a slaughter in Darfur in 2003-2004. I have no disagreement with that. Secondly, all sources now, from the UN to the sections of the US government themselves, recognize that from 2005, the average level of monthly mortality amongst civilians killed through violence has been less than 200 a month. Now, I did not say that it's a low-intensity conflict. I'm citing the head of the UN mission there, saying it's a low-intensity conflict. I'm citing the head of the UN forces there, saying this is no longer a war, that the major problem is banditry in the countryside. So we have to go by what those on the ground are saying and not by what each one of us hopes or thinks is happening.
We're going to have to take a break right now. More of our discussion in just a moment. We'll be right back. Stay with us.